Hello and welcome to Business Insider with Mario Toneguzzi on YYC Business. Joining me today is Reynold Tetzlaff, who is Alberta Managing Director for PwC Canada. Thanks for joining us today, Reynold.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, you folks recently put out your 24th annual CEO survey. One of the things that I found interesting from Canadian CEOs is that 72% anticipate growth in the global economy this year. Can you talk a little bit about that, Reynold, and why that level of optimism is there?
Well, it's quite interesting because I think what we found is we get over 5,000 CEOs that respond to the survey globally. And what we found is it's a pretty good barometer for where the world is going. And if you look, it's interesting. If you look at last year, pre-pandemic, so this survey generally happened in January, February, there was only 14% optimism in the global economy last year at that point in time.
Wow.
So I don't know, maybe they knew something was coming that we didn't know. Who knows? But I think this year, the 72% really does show that, they've kind of weathered the storm. They're really anticipating a strong comeback this year, and they've kind of seen it, like with all the different technologies and the way we were able to work virtually. They're kind of thinking they're going to get through it and actually start to grow next year, which is great to see.
And excuse me. I imagine that optimism, that level of optimism, is only going to grow, moving forward as we see more vaccinations throughout the world taking place, right?
Yeah, I think so. And even locally, we see the same, right? Like you're starting to see more optimism just in the local Canadian economy and market as well. And there's some industries that have weathered the storm pretty well. And so, I think people look at that and say, listen, if we can get through this last year, well, there's brighter days ahead. So, hopefully.
Well, hopefully there'll be brighter days ahead. Another thing that I found really, really interesting in the survey was 54% of the CEOs plan to increase their investment in the area of environmental, social, and governance. Tell me a little bit about that. Why is that such an important part of business operations these days?
Well, it really does affect, like, in order to attract capital, and we see it probably locally even more than Canada. In order to attract capital these days, you really need to have ESG as part of your overall plan. And so, yeah, there certainly is on the radar, I would say, of it, most executives and most boards as well, not only in the province, but in Canada. But there was a bit of an anomaly on the whole side in that in Canada, for example, there was only 32% that sort of factored ESG into their risk mitigation versus globally that was 60%. Oh, wow. So there were a couple anomalies around the environmental side where I thought it would actually been higher in Canada, and versus globally, we were certainly lower than global when the companies were thinking about risk and the CEOs.
Well, and here's an interesting thing about that survey is that the energy, utility, and resource sectors were the biggest proponents of ESG, which is kind of goes against the popular grain of thought, right, these days.
Yeah, I think because they've been living in it and they get it. They know that in order to raise capital, they really need to be able to sort of show the investors that they're taking this serious. And so I think the local group and the local energy, utility, mining sector really has sort of, they've accepted it. They know it's part of sort of the world they're living in. And so they probably have more acceptance in that industry than the others, just because they know that they need to get it right.
Yeah, no doubt. Anything else, Reynold, from the survey that struck you as interesting and important to note?
I think if you look at the top threats, in Canada, the top threat was cyber, and globally, the top threat was the pandemic. And it's interesting because the cyber was a large threat even before some of the recent cyber activity that have happened around pipelines and such. And so, I think with companies going more virtual and with all the technology that they keep adopting more and more, it really has become at the forefront of risk. And I think that's going to continue down the road, especially when you've seen some of the sort of the ransomware attacks that have happened globally that are sort of high profile right now.
Yeah, exactly. That's yeah, it's a key area that we businesses may not have been thinking about so much 10, 20 years ago, but man, these days you've got to be on top of that, don't you?
Well, and it's really risk mitigation, right? Is the key around that. And then maybe one other one that I found quite interesting is the differences between threats to growth in Alberta versus nationally. Like Alberta, the top ones were there was over regulation, over policy uncertainty, and tax were the top three in Alberta, which is way different than the pandemic and cyber were the top couple, for example, for Canada. So because of all the regulatory matters that we've been dealing with in Alberta, it was top of the list, and policy as well. And in Canada, it was further down the chain. So it was quite a difference between the Alberta CEOs and the Canadian CEOs.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Reynold, for joining us today.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
All right, that was Reynold Tetzlaff, who is Alberta Managing Partner, for PwC Canada. This has been Business Insider with Mario Toneguzzi on YYC Business. Thanks for joining us today.